By the 1890s, the scramble for Africa was well underway, but many countries still lay unclaimed, especially across the Sahara, in the south like the Boer republics, and in Central Africa. Central Africa was in fact home to some ancient kingdoms, but they now lay in the middle of colonialists rushing in their direction. The Belgians had just defeated the slavers and moved into eastern Congo, the British had expanded through Kenya, and the Germans through Tanzania. Plus, in the north, the mahdist was still in open rebellion. All of these were about to meet and claim the Central African kingdoms for themselves. As for the locals, let's start with Uganda. This was the location of a number of kingdoms like Bunyoro, Toro, Busogo, and Ankoli. But the most powerful during the 19th century was Buganda. These kingdoms go back hundreds of years. Bunyoro, for instance, dates back to the 14th century, and it used to be the most dominant kingdom. But by the 19th century, they lost a great deal of power to Buganda. From the middle of the 19th century, the kingdom of Buganda was ruled by Mutesa, a man that the French and Belgian missionaries wanted to rule over a Christian kingdom. But he was not a Christian. He kept to his traditional religion despite Muslims, Protestants, and Catholics all attempting to convert him. In fact, many of the rulers here refused to allow foreigners into their country or meddle in their affairs. For instance, Karabiga, the king of Bunyoro, fought back Sir Samuel White Baker back in 1872. Baker had been tasked to explore and hopefully annex parts of Uganda on behalf of the Egyptians, but most of his men, who were actually convicts, deserted him and the whole thing was a disaster. While in Buganda, when Mutesa died, his son Mwanga II began to persecute anybody who had converted. Yet, by now, his court and country were filled with converts, either Protestant, Catholic or Muslim, and all of them vied for power. He even killed the first Anglican Archbishop of East Africa, James Hannington, in 1885, and burnt some Catholic converts alive in 1886. This encouraged the British to lend their support to rebel Christians and Muslims. Mwanga was then ousted and replaced by his brother in 1888, but this brother in turn was ousted by the Muslims, who put another brother on the throne. So Mwanga, now in exile, made a deal with the British, return him to the throne and gain rights in his country. The British agreed, and in late 1890, the East Africa Company helped him secure his throne, and by 1894, Buganda had become an official protectorate of Britain. Mwanga would later try to rebel in 1897, but was defeated and fled into German Tanzania. Now with a base in Uganda, the British targeted the other kingdoms. Like in 1893, Colonel Henry Colville launched an attack on Bunyoro. They were able to take over the kingdom, but Kabirega withdrew into the countryside. There he launched a guerrilla war against the invaders for years, until the British were finally able to capture him in 1899. To the south of Uganda there is Rwanda, which was ruled for most of the 19th century by Kigeli IV. He prohibited foreigners from his country, especially the Zanzibari slave traders, and protected his country using modern rifles, which he mainly acquired from the Germans. The Germans did manage to enter his kingdom in 1893 when Count von Gotzen led an expedition west, trying to assert control over Tanzania and beyond. But Rwanda remained independent. Kigeli even managed to expand the borders of his kingdom a bit, but in doing so, he is credited with worsening the relations between the Tutsi and the Hutus. This is because the Tutsis were given higher positions, and in later years, the Europeans would make this division even worse, and eventually this would boil over into genocide in the 20th century. Then when he died, the country was thrown into chaos. His son Mbambwe IV took over in 1895, but the previous king had many wives, and these wives had a lot of power. Mbambwe's mother had already died, so another royal wife named Kanjogira plotted to remove him from power and install her own son. She launched the Rukunshu coup, and Yuhi V, her son, became king. The new royals accepted German protection and their help in cementing their control over the country during this time of chaos, and thus another country had lost their independence. Further south still there was Burundi, which was then ruled by Umwezi IV. He was another long-reigning monarch, ruling from 1852, and again another ruler who had successfully defended his nation from slavers and colonizers for years. Like in 1884, he defeated the slaver Rumaliza in battle. Yet again his downfall came from within, as some like Inanga Makoko allied themselves with the Germans in a bid for power. Faced with rebellion, Mwezi also accepted German protection in 1890, in exchange for them helping him remain in power. So all the Central African nations had fallen under European control, but, like elsewhere, their old monarchies remained. However, just before we reach 1895, there were a couple more conflicts in Africa to highlight. Firstly, the Spanish in Melilla were attacked by a group of tribesmen known as Riffians. This was carried out after the Spanish began to improve their fortifications in the region, which they had owned for hundreds of years. Then, despite some aid from the Moroccans under Hassan I, the Riffians were promptly defeated and the Spanish expanded their base in northern Morocco. But the Rif tribes would be a problem for the Spanish in the decades to come. Meanwhile, in the south of Morocco, or Spanish Sahara, they had established a base in the Rio de Oro Peninsula. There they appointed Emilio Bonelli as governor, but their expansion was hindered due to the Sawari tribesmen. Otherwise, there's just one final conflict to mention, the French invasion of Madagascar. Now, if you watched the last episode, you would have seen that the French had already invaded Madagascar and forced their Merina dynasty to accept their protection way back in 1885. But the terms of the treaty were vague, and the Madagascan Prime Minister and his queen, Ranavalona III, refused to accept their loss of sovereignty. Diplomatic relations were subsequently broke off, and in 1894 the French invaded. Disease took the lives of more Frenchmen than battles did, as they marched inland and forced the Queen to surrender instead of having her royal palace bombarded with artillery. But the government of Madagascar really couldn't do much to defend their island in the first place. For starters, they made themselves incredibly unpopular by converting to Christianity, and then ethnic groups like the Anti-Fasci had either been massacred or enslaved during the ruling dynasty's expansionist wars in the decades prior. So rebellions broke out almost immediately as soon as the French landed. The Queen was then exiled, but the French had to subdue a number of anti-Christian uprisings as the country was brought firmly under their control. Meanwhile, up the coast, there was the short, incredibly short, Anglo-Zanzibar War. This war began when Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini died, and Khalid bin Bargash took the throne. This may seem pretty innocent, but according to past treaties, any sultan needed to get British approval before taking the throne, something that bin Bargash did not have. He was, after all, far more anti-British than other contenders, like Hamoud bin Mohammed, who the British intended to put on the throne. So the British went to war, bombarded Zanzibar and won, and the whole thing lasted around 40 minutes, making it the shortest war in history. The British then installed their puppet as sultan, and as one positive takeaway, the British forced him to outlaw slavery. This was a monumental moment in the history of the region, as Zanzibaris had been enslaving Africans deep into the Congo and selling them across the Indian Ocean for centuries. Plus, the British were making moves elsewhere, especially in the south, against the independent Boer republics. There, the Boers under Paul Kruger managed to improve their economy a great deal. In fact, they improved it so much that they began to challenge the British Cape Colony for dominance in the region. So, fearing their position in South Africa was being challenged, expansionists like Cecil Rhodes hoped to encourage a rebellion among the Uitlanders, foreigners who had migrated to Transvaal during the gold rush. They did lack many rights and discontent within the community was high. So, in 1895, Rhodes helped organise the Jameson raid into Transvaal without authorisation from London. This raid, however, failed and Rhodes was forced to resign as the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Plus, it encouraged Transvaal to import foreign arms, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany sent a telegram to Kruger congratulating the Boers. This Kruger telegram worsened Anglo-German relations in the build-up to World War I, and the British began to fear a German-Boer alliance, so war between the two would eventually break out in 1899. So the Boer republics had kept their independence, but in East Africa, the Ethiopians had not only managed to maintain their independence, but they expanded their borders under Johannes IV. However, he was killed in battle against the Mahdists of Sudan, and Menelik became the new emperor, and he continued to expand south. He was also the leader who established the city of Addis Ababa, the current capital city, founded the country's first banks, post office and railway lines. Plus, he introduced electricity into the new city. He, however, had a harder time at abolishing the slave trade, despite amputating slavers, as his control was somewhat limited in the growing country, and he faced a couple of famines. But he strengthened relations with Russia, got weapons from them, and this proved vital because in 1895 the Italians invaded. The Italians had for the past few years been fighting the Mahdists in a number of battles, and controversially seized Massawa in 1894, angering the Ethiopians who wanted a seaport. They then used past treaties signed with the Ethiopians, poorly translated treaties, to justify their invasion. 15,000 Italians and their allies marched inland and met over 100,000 Ethiopians at the Battle of Adwa in March 1896. There the poorly trained, outnumbered and unprepared Italians lost to the Ethiopians, making it one of the only African countries to maintain their independence, with the other being Liberia. This was a great humiliation for the Italians and weakened their position in East Africa. They could have even lost land to the mahdists. But fortunately for them, the mahdists faced a number of enemies. For instance, the Belgians had managed to push east through the Congo, and in 1894 they were given the Lado Enclave by the British, a small piece of land in South Sudan. But this was currently occupied by the mahdists, and this brought Belgium into the war against them. The Congo Free State crushed the mahdists at the Battle of Rajaf in 1897, but faced a number of mutinies among the Datila people they conscripted. This was particularly important because this prevented the Belgians from moving on to their desired target of Fashoda, where the British and French would later meet and almost go to war. So, had they not mutinied, maybe there could have been a three-way standoff between the British, French and Belgians. As for the British, they had finally tried to get their revenge on the mahdists, and in 1896 began building railway lines to invade. Under Kitchener they would move south quickly, and in 1898 crushed the mahdists at Omdurman. There the British only lost around 48 men, compared to 12,000 mahdists killed and 5,000 captured. Khartoum was then brought under Anglo-Egyptian rule, and the British continued to push south, eventually killing the new mahdist leader in battle in late 1899. They were then set to take over South Sudan, but back in 1897, two Frenchmen set off on expeditions to unite the colonies in the east and west. Christian de Bonchamp set off from Djibouti, and Jean-Baptiste Marchand set off from French Congo, both hoping to meet in South Sudan. Bonchamp, however, failed to get beyond the Ethiopian highlands and hostile locals, but Marchand did succeed, and he made it to Fashoda in July 1898. Once there, however, he was soon joined by Kitchener, who arrived after their victory over the mahdists with 1,500 men. Marchand, on the other hand, only had 20 French officers and 100 African troops, so he was keen to avoid conflict. He and Kitchener therefore both met and avoided conflict, agreeing to await orders from their respected governments before acting. The British stood firm in their claims, while in France they were more divided. For instance, some saw Germany as the major enemy, and didn't want to antagonize a potential ally in their future war against the Germans. Then the infamous trial of Dreyfus took place. He was a Jewish man who was allegedly spying for the Germans, and this drew attention away from Fashoda. So the French were able to peacefully resolve the crisis and withdrew, avoiding conflict with Britain. But French nationalists like a young Charles de Gaulle felt humiliated at the French withdrawal, and the future French focus in the defense of their African colonies has been dubbed the Fashoda Syndrome. Yet the French were having far more success elsewhere. In 1898 they had finally managed to defeat Samori Touré, a Muslim ruler who they'd been fighting for the last 2 decades. But despite initial victories against the French, his support had waned, and the French captured him and sent him into exile. This defeat, along with treaties signed with other great powers, firmly cemented French control over most of West Africa, including the interior of the Ivory Coast and the likes. The general that finally achieved this victory was Henri Gouraud, and he became a hero in France. He would later serve in World War I, and then, after the war, crushed the Great Syrian Revolt. This victory opened the path to French conquering the lands controlled by Rabi az-Zubayr. I mentioned him back in the 3rd episode, but as a recap, he was a warlord from Sudan who carved out a state for himself. In 1887 he invaded Darfur and then pushed further west, taking over the Bagrimi Sultanate and forcing its ruler, Gaurang II, to flee in 1893. The same year he conquered the old Bornu Empire and made Dikwa, now in Nigeria, his capital city. Hoping to modernize, he reached out to the Royal Niger Company, but he was an infamous slaver, and there were a number of stories about his brutality, so he was turned away. In response, he began to launch even more raids, threatening the Niger Company, which was now surrounded by 2 major Islamic empires, Rabi's and the Sokoto. But it was the French who were about to change this. From the Congo they sent Emile Gentil to meet with Gaurang II, and his Bagrimi Sultanate, or what was left of it, was put under French protection. Then, when this sultanate was threatened by Rabi, the French sent troops from the Congo in 1899, but they were wiped out at the Battle of Togbau. However, Rabi's power was beginning to weaken. As the British defeated the mahdists, their influence, albeit not full control yet, expanded into the likes of Darfur. Then, 3 different French forces were converging on the region from different parts of their empire. Emile Gentil led troops again from the Congo, the Faroe Lamy mission was heading through the Sahara from Algeria, and the Volé-Chanon mission was coming from the west. This Volé-Chanon mission was incredibly brutal. They set off with just a small force, but left a trail of destruction in their midst. The atrocities were so bad that the French sent Jean-Francois Club from Timbuktu to intercept them and take control. On the way, he would have seen torched villages, numerous civilians hung from trees, and even children cooking on fire. But when they met, Volée had Club killed, and declared that he was no longer a Frenchman, but a black chief, and the conqueror of an empire. But this just prompted a mutiny, and both leaders were killed. Lieutenant Pollier took control of the mission at Zinda in Mali, and proceeded to head over to Kuseri in northern Cameroon. The three expeditions then met up, captured the town, and defeated Rabi in battle. He was killed during the conflict, and his empire promptly disintegrated, with the French taking most of it except Bornu, which later went to the British. As for the British, their military presence in Nigeria grew after a conflict against the Istakari leader, Chief Olomu, back in 1894. Now, Chief Olomu acted as an intermediary between the British and the then still independent nation of Benin. But when Olomu tried to expand his holdings, the British captured him and took his lands. But the authorities still didn't permit an invasion of Benin. Nevertheless, James Robert Phillips moved into Benin without permission. To hide his attentions, he hid all of the weapons, but this proved to be disastrous, as the Order of Benin found out about the invasion and ambushed them. Because their weapons were hidden, they had no way to defend themselves, and most were killed in January 1897. However, as always, this massacre prompted a punitive expedition with the full backing of the Royal Navy. Around 1,500 Marines plus local troops marched on the capital of Benin and torched villages on their way. Rockets were then fired indiscriminately, and the walls of Benin, the largest earthworks created, were completely destroyed. The kingdom was then disbanded, and many of the artwork was shipped back to Europe, including the famous Benin bronzes. But the British in Nigeria didn't stop there, as the Nembi kingdom had been placed in the British sphere of influence at the Conference of Berlin, but their king Frederick William Koko had refused to allow the British into his region. Yet this region became increasingly more valuable since the discovery of oil and the formation of the British Oil Rivers Protectorate. But in 1895, Koko renounced Christianity and led an attack on the company's base at Akassa. A couple dozen British settlers were captured and ceremonially executed, and some reports indicate that they were eaten. This was again followed by a punitive expedition, and Koko was deposed. Now public opinion was slowly turning against the private African companies and their leaders like George Goldie. However, Koko went a little bit too far with the cannibalism. Then living in exile, he was probably the inspiration behind King Koko the Fantapo in the Dr. Dolittle books. So Goldie was therefore able to keep control of his Niger company, and in 1897 he personally led attacks on small Islamic states like the Bida Emirate. But this success finally meant the end of the private companies in West Africa though, as up against German and French state-sponsored colonies, they really didn't stand much of a chance to compete. So the charter was finally revoked a couple years later, and the British government took control of Nigeria. Meanwhile, the nearby Ashanti had been turned into a British protectorate back in 1891, but by 1894, King Prempeh I was refusing to allow the British to establish a residency in his capital Kumasi. So the British, led by the likes of Robert Baden-Powell, marched on the city and forced Prempeh into exile. This was a remarkably peaceful expedition, as the Ashanti more or less gave up without a fight. But some British did die mainly of disease like malaria, like Prince Henry, the son-in-law of Queen Victoria. The British, by the way, justified this war and other actions by saying they were hoping to end human sacrifice, slave trading, and to establish peace. But as you can probably guess, they mainly wanted to prevent the French or Germans moving into Ashantiland and to claim the riches of the kingdom. The causes for the next war with the Ashanti were a little more ridiculous, as it began when Frederick Mitchell Hodgson insisted that he should be able to find and probably sit on the golden stool. This was pretty scandalous, as the stool served as a symbol of not only the royal family, but also the kingdom at large. Only the king had the authority to even touch it, so the fact a British person wanted to find the stool which was hidden was incredibly offensive to the Ashanti, but some say that Hodgson just didn't realise how important it was. So the Ashanti rose up under the Queen Mother Ya Ashantiwa in March 1900, forcing the British to retreat to a small stockade. But with the help of a few hundred Hausa soldiers, they fought off the attacking Ashanti until a relief force helped them escape. A second expedition was sent into the capital and forced the remaining royal family to surrender, but they surrendered on the condition that the stool would not be touched by a Brit or non-Akan person. Akan, by the way, are the people that lived in the Ashanti kingdom. So the Ashanti, despite being annexed, claimed victory. As for the stool, it was discovered in 1920 by road workers, and it is currently housed in the British-built Ashanti Palace. But let's move away from West Africa, as the late 19th century saw developments elsewhere. In Zambia, the British had already secured the south back in 1890, as they secured a deal with Lewanika, the ruler of Barotseland. But the north still lay unclaimed, and was sitting directly in between British and Belgian control. On the Belgian side was the province of Katanga, the former lands of the slaver Umsiri, and this land the British had tried to claim. However, Alfred Sharp was never able to make a deal with Umsiri, so the Belgians just moved in and killed him and claimed it for themselves. The British therefore were unwilling to let this happen again, but Alfred Sharp once again failed to strike a deal with the leader of northern Zambia. This was Mwata Kazembe X. He did give the British some mining concessions in this resource-rich land and allowed some missionaries into his country, but largely he refused to submit. For instance, he refused the British South Africa Company the right to fly the Union Jack, and stopped their tax collectors from getting money from his citizens. He even began to clash with company troops in the late 1890s, prompting Alfred Sharp to send in troops from Malawi. Seeing British machine guns and cannons and even Sikh troops, the king retreated without a fight. Missionaries gave him refuge and then helped him negotiate his return to power. The British agreed to this, and for the remainder of his life, he worked closely with the company. Thus, the British had secured Zambia for themselves. However, they were now too late to realise their dream of connecting Cape Town to Cairo, and would need to wait until the end of the First World War for that. Otherwise, also in the late 1890s over in Somalia, the Dervish movement had begun, and this would continue until the 1920s. Somalia, to recap, was one of the first countries to be brought into European spheres at the beginning of the Scramble, but European control was limited. The Italians, British and French had just signed deals with local rulers and largely allowed them to govern independently. They also made deals with each other over the borders, like allowing Italian Eritrea to expand. Plus, the borders between Britain and Ethiopia were cemented late in the century, but controversially, the Ethiopians were given Ogaden. This region is made up mainly of Somalis, and is a source of hostility between the two nations still today. So, in Somalia, the sultanates of Marjateen, Wasangali and the likes were still there, and their rulers like Mahamoud Ali Shire of Wasangali, despite signing agreements, would join in the dervish movement against the colonizers once it began. The whole rebellion was started by a Sufi poet, Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. After travelling to Mecca, he was inspired to return home and remove the Western and Christian presence from his homeland. Think almost like the Mahdi rebellion in Sudan, as he launched a religious war against colonizers. There were in fact quite a few similar movements popping up across the Muslim world. For instance, there were jihadi states in the west, and in the north, Hassan had connections with the Sunusi order, which I'll discuss in the next episode. By using religious rhetoric, he did something that had almost been impossible just a few years prior. He had united the warring Somali tribes into a powerful fighting force, one which wanted to rid the region of Christians. As he said, the Europeans were converting their children, and made our children their children. Around 6,000 men joined him as he first attacked the Ethiopians and secured their first victory. Then he began launching attacks on British Somaliland, and he was dubbed the Mad Mullah by the British press. However, it would take the British to use planes after World War I to finally crush the uprising. This was largely because of the mobility of the dervish fighters. Their ranks were filled with pastoral horsemen, so whenever their territory was overwhelmed by the British or Italians, they could just pick up, move, and establish a new base somewhere else. Meanwhile, they were being supported by the local sultans, who wanted to claim back their independence, sympathizers in Sudan, and even, allegedly, the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't even the only rebellion going on in Somalia, as in the south, in Italian Somaliland, there was the Banadir resistance. This was led by the Bimal clan and began years earlier. Plus, it would actually last a little longer than the dervish movement. Although it was largely clan-based, they too used religious rhetoric to stir up the population, often through poetry. One poem ended, "Those who resist are heaven-bound, those who submit can stay home in hell where they belong." So poets were influential in both rebellions. Hassan would actually trade insults and poems with another anti-colonist, Uwais al-Barawi. Barawi began the insults as he favoured a more peaceful solution, and accused the rebels of being Wahhabi. In one poem he wrote, "They are the justifiers of spilling the blood of the ulama, and of wealth and women. They are libertines. They prohibit the study of sciences such as law and grammar. They are repugnant. Their characteristic is to wear their hair like the Wahhabi. They are a sect of dogs. For these accusations, Barawi would be assassinated by Hassan in 1909. Yet of course these weren't the only rebellions. They were popping up across the continent, like the Bailundu revolt in Portuguese Angola. There, the Ovumbundu kingdoms, including the Bailundu kingdom, had lost their independence back in 1890. But the region was seeing an increase in Portuguese activity. This, along with the economic problems, obviously angered the locals. But the conflict began in 1902 when the Portuguese accused the king of Bailundu's councillor of not paying for bottles of rum. Tensions rose, the Portuguese imprisoned their leaders, and the rebellion began. The Portuguese enlisted the help of Boer settlers and chased the rebels into the mountains and continued to launch expeditions against them until 1904, when they were finally defeated. But going back to Muslim uprisings and wars. Over in the west, the Germans had finally settled their Togolese borders in exchange for some Pacific islands. But they still only held onto the coast of Cameroon. To the north lay the Muslim kingdom or Fondom of Bafut. This small state was attacked numerous times by the Germans between 1901 and 1907. However, they never really submitted to German rule, and the Germans had to just reinstate their ruler when no good replacement was found. So the Bafut Wars were a costly affair. Otherwise, there was the Sokoto Empire further north, the Jihad state which had held off European advances so far. Inside their empire were a number of autonomous regions, one of which was Adamawa. Inside Adamawa in the late 1890s, there were a number of internal conflicts. For instance, there was yet another person claiming to be the Mahdi, Hayatu ibn Said. He began to rebel against the crown, so the Germans, claiming to want to end the Islamic slave trade, took this opportunity to move in 1899. But the Muslims resisted fiercely, and in 1901, the Germans had only really managed to subjugate Tapati. That year they met with the Emir, Zubairu ibn Adama, to discuss the possibility of placing his lands under German protection. But this came to nothing, so the Germans attacked again, while the British, looking to exploit the situation, moved on Yola. Zubairu was then on the run. He appealed to the Sokoto for help, plus the calls for jihad inspired many mahdist supporters to join forces with the Emir. Together they tried to reclaim land but failed. Slowly, sultans of different cities broke from the Sokoto and swore allegiance to the Germans or the British. As for Zubairu, he was killed by tribal enemies in 1903. As the Germans moved north, the British, led by the likes of Frederick Lugard, proceeded north as well and occupied Kano. Lugard, by the way, wrote the Dual Mandate in British tropical Africa. In this he justifies colonialism, saying it stopped slavery, ended what he called barbaric practices and the likes. But he goes one step further and says that colonialism was a fad, and the British needed to get involved so they didn't look weak. So you can see why he decided to join the Germans in partitioning the Sokoto Caliphate. Otherwise, he did argue in favour of indirect rule as the best way to run a profitable colony, prevent uprisings and the likes. However, although this is what he argued, he very rarely allowed educated Nigerians to take over positions of power. Anyway, after fleeing Kano, the Emir of the city, Ali Obaba, tried to reclaim his power, but he was defeated. The British were therefore free to move on to the city of Sokoto, where Muhammadu Atahiro I tried to put up a fight, but he also failed. He in fact called on his people to join him on a migration known as a hijra. Thousands of people joined in, and he moved from his capital into the countryside. The British then pursued this mass of people migrating across Nigeria until they caught up with them and crushed the caliph's armies. After the battle, the British found Muhammadu coming out of a mosque and shot him, ending the Sokoto Caliphate. The lands were partitioned between the Germans and British, and photos of the dead caliph were dispatched across his lands to prevent uprisings. But this did very little to actually help, as within a couple of years there would be huge rebellions across the country. While all of this was going on, the French had begun to move into Mauritania, but there they hoped to peacefully penetrate the region. Xavier Kopolani orchestrated the entire plot, and it worked incredibly well. Beginning in 1901, he formed alliances with sheikhs, Shidya Baba and Saad Bou. They were leaders of the Qadriya Sufi Brotherhood and held a great deal of power. They agreed to join France because they were promised protection against their rival Hassani tribes and a position of power within the new colonial government. So this was just divide and rule. These men persuaded the Emirate of Trarza to join France in 1904, but of course not everyone was happy about this. To the north of them, Ma al-Ain Ain had been appointed as the commander of Tindouf by the Sultan of Morocco, but today this is part of Algeria. He was a fierce anti-colonist, and had already begun to build a fort known as Rabat in Smara in Spanish Sahara, with the intention of launching attacks and chasing the Spanish out. But then the French also arrived nearby, and he launched a jihad on them, in the name of Sultan Abdelaziz of Morocco. The Sultan, although not directly involved, seems to have supported the jihad by being a middleman for the purchase of weapons, and it is believed that one of his men assassinated Kopolani, ending French expansion into the interior of Mauritania for a couple of years. But we need to go back to Nigeria for a bit, as the British looked to fully cement their control over the Aro Confederacy. The Aro people had thus far been unwilling to allow any real European settlement in their lands, despite technically being under British influence. They were deeply religious people and saw any foreigners as a threat to their beliefs. Central to their religion was an oracle called Ibini Ukpabi. They would, of course, perform religious duties, but also would settle legal disputes, murder cases and the likes. The trials would take place in Arochukwu in a cave complex. Inside the caves there were a number of quite ominous sounding shrines and tunnels, like the Shrine of Nakedness, where the guilty would be stripped, and the Tunnels of Disappearance. This tunnel got its name because whoever lost the trial was sometimes killed, or personally sold as a slave, by the Ipini Ukpabi. This ongoing slave trade eventually gave the British their cause for war, but on religion for a moment, a number of secret societies and almost cults began to develop around West Africa at that time, like the Ekpa in Nigeria. These claimed that they could apparently speak to their ancestors, and many young boys would be sworn into the society as soon as they became men, and for life they would be sworn to secrecy and had to pay membership fees. Plus, alongside their religious roles, they would, in full ceremonial dress, do police work, grabbing the attention of the British. There was also the Poro and their female equivalent, the Sandi. Their men would go and listen to a man dressed in full fetish dress, give speeches and occasionally place taboos on things, while the women would attend masquerades and, unfortunately, perform female genital mutilation. These groups, by the way, still exist today, but they weren't the most violent groups. There were some like the Leopard Society in Sierra Leone. Their members would dress in leopard skins and ritually cannibalize people, believing it would give them more power. And you can maybe see a link between groups like this in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and later reports of cannibalism in the civil wars of the 20th century. But back to the Aro. They attacked the town of Ubegu, which was allied with the British. So the British began preparing for war. It took a while to build up the forces, but in 1901 they were ready. The British won very quickly, and the Aro Confederacy fell into British hands, but some guerrilla conflicts persisted. For instance, the Ikumiku War persisted until the outbreak of World War I. And finally, the last conflict of this period occurred in the south, and it was the Second Boer War. It began when the British began to build up troops along the Transvaal border until September 1899, when Kruger sent an ultimatum demanding that they withdraw. This, however, was ignored, and war was declared in October. Thousands of foreigners joined to help the Boers in the early stages of the war, as they lay siege to towns like Ladysmith and Kimberley. But in 1900, thousands of British reinforcements arrived to relieve the besieged cities. Their march was temporarily halted at the Battle of Spion Kop, a battle which Gandhi and Churchill both witnessed. By that May, Robert Baden-Powell had relieved the city of Mafeking, and in June, both Johannesburg and Pretoria were captured. But many Boers like Della Ray, Jan Smuts and Louis Botha launched a guerrilla war, and the 250,000 British troops struggled to maintain control over the region, so they built thousands of blockhouses around South Africa to defend their supply lines. Herbert Kitchener also began burning crops, houses and anything that could potentially aid the guerrillas. Captured Boer men were then deported to colonies like Bermuda and St. Helena, while mainly women and children were sent to concentration camps, where around 40,000 people died, many of which were children. This was met with outrage internationally. So thousands of Dutch, Scandinavians, French, Irish, Americans, Italians and more joined in the war on the side of the Boers. The Russians as well were also keen supporters of the Boer cause, not only because they had a mutual enemy, but also because they believed that they shared similar values. As Tolstoy wrote in his diary, "Opening a paper every morning, I passionately wish to read that the Boers have beaten the British, it cheers my soul." Plus in Britain many also actually opposed the war, notably the Liberal Party under Bannerman. But patriotic fervour won out, and the Liberals were defeated in the so-called khaki election. As the war dragged on, the Boer guerrillas were increasingly unable to carry out their raids, and both sides became worried about black people like the Swazi becoming involved in the war. So the Bitter Enders, as they were called, made peace in 1902, and the Boer republics were annexed. Plus, in the aftermath, Swaziland finally accepted British protection. Although reconstruction and amnesty was offered to the Boers, the British governor, Alfred Milner, tried to anglicise the newly conquered regions. But this worsened race relations and fueled Boer nationalism. So when the Union of South Africa was declared in 1910, many Boer leaders like Botha and Smuts were elected as prime ministers. However, by now, the majority of the South and West was colonised. Yet even by the early 20th century, some nations were still free from European rule, although very few. The final nations to fall, like Morocco, would cause tensions between the great powers in the build-up to the First World War. Otherwise, there was of course a wave of unrest against colonisation. For instance, there was the Maji Maji revolt against the Germans in Tanzania, and more mahdist uprisings. Plus, great crimes were committed, like the genocide of the Herero, forced labour, and a great deal more. But all of that will be discussed in the last episode.